we need to make sure that clinical trials are as efficient and timely as possible. What is achievable as opposed to a marketing buzzword? So what is the risk of not adopting this technology?
Welcome to the conversation. In today's episode of Trailblazers, Johnny is speaking to Lauren Alani, Director of Digital Innovation at SUSE Plus. We hope you enjoy the episode. Be sure to follow us on social and subscribe.
Lauren, pleasure to have you here. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in your journey so far.
So I'm Lauren Alani. I'm the Director of Digital Innovation at SUSE Plus, which is a life science consulting organisation who support biotechnology companies and small technology companies scale up. I have come from medical microbiology and immunology background. I have been in clinical research for the last 15 years. For the last 5, I've really focused on innovative technology. I have also chaired community expert groups within the last 5 years and produced a lot of thought leadership content on the innovative technology in our industry and how it can really add value to clinical trials. So that includes things like DCT, integrating EHR, wearables. I've mapped out the full clinical systems, or the technologies that sort of come together to kind of make clinical trials as efficient as possible. And the next exciting one that we're hoping to publish is on the integration of these systems. So helping to streamline and make the data more efficient.
For those that may not know, what does the current process look like? How can you explain, and probably for those that are non-clinicians, what does that look like in terms of clinical trials?
Clinical trials are typically 3 phases. The first phase focuses on the safety of the asset. The second phase looks at the efficacy of the asset, and then the third phase really explores the wider population. So does it have the same efficacy for those patient groups in a broader sense? All of that data is then consolidated and goes for regulatory approval. Once they've gained regulatory approval, the data is also used to help really have the value of the medication and what populations are willing to pay for it in certain countries. Depending on the regulators, they may also request that there is an additional phase, so phase 4. So that's post-approval, and that phase is typically to explore the long-term safety and efficacy data of the asset. It can also be used to help create differentiation of the product if it's not clear what the benefits and impact for the patient are when it comes to quality of life.
So there's the stage 3, up to that point it's kind of drug release, and then you've got it once it's in the wild. Stage 4 is, okay, what's the long-term implication for patients if they have to continue to take this for years and years, I suppose?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. What are the current challenges with getting a drug from molecule to market and clinical trials as they stand at the moment?
I mean, there are a huge number of challenges, but I think in the broader sense, the biggest challenge that we all have is that clinical trials are getting more and more expensive, and the duration of trials are getting longer and longer, which is not sustainable. We need to be able to make clinical trials more efficient, so that we can effectively reduce the cost of new drugs that are coming to the market, and also to make sure that the patients that need these medications can get them in the time frame, in their lifespan. We need to make sure that clinical trials are as efficient and timely as possible. Yeah,
and what does that mean in terms of leveraging technology? So how can technology play a role in enabling that medication to reach more people who need it?
So there's lots of different ways that technology can help. So technology can be used at any point during clinical trials, and even before clinical trials. So it can be used at really early phases, like preclinical, for example, using AI and machine learning to facilitate better drug discovery. It can be used even in between clinical trials, and that could be used for things like using modelling and simulation to be really clear and specific on the patient groups that are actually going to see a benefit of the asset. It can be used to explore previous enrolment rates, or what other clinical trials are in the area, so that when you are facilitating your enrolment strategy, you actually are doing so with a very data-driven process to make sure that your enrolment stands the best chance possible. So that's actually one of the key reasons that clinical trials tend to fail, is through lack of enrolment. Technology can also be used during clinical trials. So for things like preventing dropouts. So if the clinical trial is done in a way that's very engaging and people want to be a part of the journey, then they're less likely to drop out of the clinical trial, but they're also more likely to give data accurately and on time, which can mean that the amount of data that you're collating is what you need to in order to show the treatment effect and the impact on the patient. So it's really important that this is all all the technology is really assessed for the value it can drive for your given clinical trial and where you are in the process.
Yeah, I mean, the two things that spring to mind for me that might have an impact in is if you can leverage digital technology to enable more data points more easily, and you lessen certain barriers for those that are participating in them, it would probably improve timelines and the inclusion of people that are represented in that clinical trial data and the DEI. How does that kind of play out at the moment in terms of the current situation as to potentially lack of representation in some of the data that we get from clinical trials?
Yeah, that's a really key point. So there's a rise of new technologies, which was really around COVID. COVID was such a facilitator in the sense that it really made our industry look at how to do things better. And one of the innovative technologies that was really adopted was this kind of rise of DCT, so decentralized clinical trials, because during COVID patients couldn't go to site, they couldn't do the normal kind of clinical trial engagement. So then they looked at how can we bring clinical trials to the patient? And what this rise of different types of technology enabled is patients that then live further from site could access clinical trials, which means that more diverse groups could then be involved. And of course, we know that from looking at the data that there are different groups of subgroups of patients that do have different impact on the medications and assets. So it's really important that we understand the nuances of different populations and that we are ensuring that we're collecting that data. And obviously the recent guidance from FDA has really meant that organisations, so biotechs and pharma, now have to have a diversity and inclusion consideration into their trial, which I think is a really positive move for our industry.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely massive, because I know that in some of the data there's a certain lack of representation with regards to, actually on the area of women, working mothers, for example, who don't often have the ability to afford childcare. I think it's something in the data that if it's over 9 miles away in terms of travel for a clinical trial to submit some of that information or take a read, that tends to have a massive dropout rate. So that's really interesting. What I guess this is leading towards is greater innovation within, healthcare, within medtech and all this sort of stuff. What's some of the horizon scanning looking like in terms of that innovation spend, I suppose, from these guys, and how's that playing out?
So the landscape and innovations are really, really broad, and they're across, the full lifespan of a clinical trial. And I think that it's very much dependent on what your goal is. You've got to be very clear on that in order to really try and understand where the key opportunities are for you, because we consider that there are over 8,000 health technology companies out there. So that's a lot of noise. Wow. And even the big pharma, big CROs, they can't actually have the time and energy to digest all of that information and to understand. I mean, typically these organizations only really have 2 to 3 approved vendors. So it's a really difficult environment to work in, because we're also a very risk-averse industry. So really, the being clear on your goals then gives you a lot more ability to really understand, okay, how do we then explore what type of technologies exist to achieve those goals. But the landscape is so interesting because it can include things like, you know, even social listening. How do we utilize social listening? How do we get more integration with EHR? Blockchain has been used by the finance industry for years and years. You know, how can we utilize that?
Electronic health records, it seems like a perfect example, right?
Yeah,
Personalized
exactly.
care, instantly available wherever you are in the world in one connected system. Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing?
Oh, that would be it's so key. And I think it is the future, and we will get there eventually, but only if we enable ourselves to adapt and understand the technology that's out there and actually implement it and adopt it into our organizations. What I see a lot of kind of big organizations doing is kind of building this capabilities up internally and acquiring, you know, these different companies. But I think we also have to remember that we're not tech companies. You know, we're in the business of healthcare and improving health and quality of life. So we need to facilitate and support these, you know, small startup and tech companies that are really creating truly valuable technology in our space. We need to support them, not you know, try and compete with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're kind of, as an industry, there's a bit of we need to become better at really working in a much more collaborative way.
Yeah, I mean, you used a beautiful phrase that I have since appropriated and stolen at the Digital Health World Congress, which was using technology or leveraging technology to scale human intervention. And I think that really does resonate with what you just said there. Being pragmatic and looking at things over a short, medium, long-term horizon, what are some of the hopes that you have in terms of what we can do to move from these three, from the place that we are now across to these three places?
So, I think it's a very interesting question. And again, I have to come down to, it depends on your goal, right? So where you are in your process, what is the technology that can get you to that endpoint today? And that's where your short-term view needs to be. It's how can I get over that problem that you perceive? So it might be a enrolment issue. It might be a data quality concern. So, for example, if you've come from a background of using paper and fax machines, and you would like to increase the quality so that you actually have more data for regulators to use to make their decision, then you might need to look at, you know, ePro, eCOA. You might want to consider wearables. But another way of looking at, you know, the goals in terms of short, medium, long term is what's our current capabilities as an industry? Where are we at with our knowledge, with our alignment with regulation, with our technology capabilities? You know, what is achievable as opposed to a marketing buzzword?
Yep.
Right? I see a lot of buzziness, and it's so difficult.
Honestly, it's the bane of my existence in terms of there's so many acronyms and buzzwords. Explain something in plain language. It's kind of like the plain language summary for those that are already initiated into the world of this. Explain it in clear and simple terms as to what the benefit will be yielded.
Yeah.
Help me understand, and then I can get you to where we want to be, rather than
Exactly.
jargon, spiel, and then everyone's like instantly kind of, not so sure about this. I want to look into this a little bit more, and it just slows things down.
Well, it slows things down, but it also stops the conversation outright, because with 8,000 companies out there, no one has the time to really get into the nuance of what it is you do. So if you can't, in that 2 seconds of, you know, lift elevator speak, if you like, but also 2 seconds of somebody even going onto your website and saying, right, I'm going to give you 2 seconds of my time to understand what you do. If they can't then immediately understand what it is you do and the value that you will drive and deliver for them, then you've lost out.
Yeah.
Because people don't have the time when there's 8,000 competitors. There's too much noise. And also we come from a very risk-averse industry. So as soon as you start talking about, you know, the impact of trust and, you know, our people are having to look through the weeds of what it is you are and look into more detail, we've already lost our trust, because we're incredibly risk-averse, and we need to know that you've got the experience and capabilities as a, you know, I appreciate new startups might not have that, but it's the leadership that are building these startups. So you need to then pull the who's building the company forward to leverage their experience and capabilities to build trust and credibility within our industry, because there's no patience for finding out, if you can't be very clear who you are.
It reminds me of the Seth Godin quote: if you can't summarize your position in 10 words or less, you don't have a position.
Yes.
And I think that's really vital because, as you say, 8,000 companies all doing different things. You need to be very, very clear. You need to cut through the noise and ultimately probably outline the value that gets to the end person, or the end user being the patient. What are some of the ways in which you think that if we tackle some of these issues and we get our planning in place for that short, medium, long-term time horizon, what are some of the benefits that improved clinical trials, improving using technologies and things like that could yield for a global population?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question. So really there's the benefits, and the first one is around improving patient outcomes. So if we are able to utilize this technology, then we're able to improve our data integrity, which means we have better quality data and volume to show the safety and efficacy of this asset, which means that the right patients are going to get the right medication in the right time frame that they need to as a global population. It also means that clinical trials are more efficient, and so they're running faster, they're finishing quicker, which means that patients get access to these medicines in a much more timely time frame. It also enables us to, because we're having shorter running clinical trials and don't have to necessarily redo them if and when our data isn't good enough or faces concerns for our regulators, and then we are looking at redoing subsequent clinical trials, then that increases the cost. So by ensuring that we have a very good data-driven approach where we're able to maintain good data integrity, well, that reduces the total cost of the drug development timeline, which then has a direct impact on our global population, because it means that these drugs will also be a lower cost and more accessible to them. And then there's some of the points that you made earlier around diversity and inclusion. So by ensuring that we can improve the access for clinical trials, it means that more diverse groups are joining the clinical trials, and therefore we have better health equity, because we understand what the benefit of these different assets are for different populations, and we're able to factor that into decision makers that clinicians are making on what drug to give to which patient. So when we think about what technologies we can use on a short-term basis, the typical ones I would look at is things like, how do you improve patient engagement? So how are you really connecting with the patients involved in your clinical trial, and do they really resonate with the purpose, and therefore understand what you want to achieve and will ensure to give you data accurately on time? And these can be things like gamification strategies, notifications, awards, and there's an organisation that does this very well, Reply-All, which has a great study with Almirall on improving patient engagement. There's also things like utilising e-consent, and e-consent in Europe can often mean something quite different, because there is a lot more complication in Europe around e-consent and which countries it's approved in. But e-consent isn't just about getting the signature, it's also about giving a patient information about the clinical trial and building that connection and what they are signing themselves up to in a way that they can also look back on. So if you're looking at a 2-year study, then they can 2 years later they still have access, they still know what they've agreed to do. So it's not just about the signature application, it's also about the benefits that come around it. More medium term, there are amazing companies out there that, for example, look at social media and starting to really tap into that social listening aspect, and that is a whole another source of data around how we can actually understand the values that matter most to patients, because that's going to impact potentially your strategy. What is it that patients are on now? What did they not like doing? Is it the number of visits they need to get into the hospital? Is it the fact that a lot of people have headaches or, whatever it might be? We're getting more real life data on the impact, and we can utilize that in our clinical trials. And then longer term, it's more about technology that is perhaps further down the line. So technology that is still needing a bit more work. So, for example, I mentioned blockchain. I'd love to see this better integration with EHR. So really getting into that and really facilitating the two-way integration. So, patients coming into a clinical trial, yes, it's fantastic if we could get this better connection to EHR and be able to reduce timeline for sites to actually input all the data that they already have in one system and physically type it into another is a huge waste of time. So actually building out that integration will significantly help sites. But having a two-way ability means that the patients that are contributing data appreciate, it is clinical trial data, but there's also a benefit. They are having bloods taken. They are getting more information on their current health. And that is really valuable data for them to have for their future, because they're the ones that are fighting for a better life, and they will be the ones that are most driven and most need this data. So facilitating that two-way connection, I think long-term will be a really critical step.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think it all comes down to, as you say, it's communication, but it builds psychological safety, which then ultimately facilitates trust in the eyes of the patient.
Yeah.
And that means more willingness to participate, to give that communication as well. And I think that's a really important part of how we move the needle in that short, medium and long-term horizon as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, as I was thinking about some of the challenges that we have as an organisation, as an industry, the challenges that we have is that a lot of these health tech startups are generally started by either people who work in technology companies or people that come from academia. Now, if you come from a technology background, you don't necessarily understand and have a good nuance of the challenges that we have in our industry. And then in academia, the challenge is that they don't necessarily have the resources and funding to be able to really crack through the ice and the noise. So the challenge that they often come to is considering this, the amount of noise out there, considering how many health technology companies are out there. They find it really challenging to create the messaging that really enables the value of their organisation to come to the fore and to resolve a specific problem in our industry and connect with that. So what they find is it's often a breakdown in communication. And then on the other side, we have, pharma and biotech organisations who are so risk averse and don't have the time and energy to really understand all the innovative technology companies out there. So what they end up doing is, approving 3 or 4 companies and sticking with them on a global perspective. They still have, particularly the pharma organisations still will have local groups that will still have flexibility, but it's that ability to actually welcome innovative organisations in, and we're actually quite closed to that as an industry. So I think we need to get better really building out our accessibility to properly looking at the innovative technology out there and how it can add value to our clinical trials by making them more efficient, more engaging and more effective.
Yeah, I mean, any situation that encourages myopathy, where you're looking at a very small and particular sliver, is just one in which you're not going to get the cognitive diversity that you want.
Yeah.
And that then leads to kind of the perspectives that might offer opportunity being missed. So I think that's a really important point to drive home as well, because it's so important. It's
so important, and it really flagged my alarm, looking at, for example, Science 37. So we've spoken a bit about, the rise of DCT around COVID. And Science 37 was one of those pioneering companies that, and is, because they're still around, but they were one of those pioneering companies that really invested in this kind of innovative technology and were bridging and building on this idea of DCTs. But what we've actually seen very recently is that they were valued at 1 billion. They had 56 million around that in the bank, and yet they were sold for 38 million. So this to me really highlights my concern for our industry around the fact that we need to get better. We need to facilitate the adoption of innovative technology that can help, because we know that clinical trials are taking longer. We know that they are very expensive. We know that we need to improve our data integrity and ensure that we can have a larger volume of data, even continuous data, that shows, you know, the benefits to patients, not only to facilitate regulatory approval, but also to facilitate those inflection points throughout the progression of a biotech organisation. So those conversations with investors and potential collaborators and partners, and in ensuring that we have a more robust data-driven strategy, they can facilitate better conversations at each inflection point. So it is really critical that we continue to assess and to make way and enable these organisations to grow, because at the end of the day, 50% of these health technology companies don't survive the first 2 years since their inception, because they essentially run out of funding. Whereas as an industry, we on average take 5.8 years to adopt a digital innovation. So those stats just don't.
Well, you've literally got a third of the time. If it takes 5.8 years and it doesn't survive 2 years, then you're literally at a third, and you'd still have 2 to go before you'd even survive.
Exactly.
It's I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, one of the things that you touched on there does really make me think about the impact that wearables and things like that could have. And you touched on that earlier as well, where it's that ability for a patient to provide continuous data reads as they're going through a trial, which could be absorbed into you know, that data bank that gives you more data integrity, that provides a better read on what's going on, how it's affecting on the day-to-day, and also multiple increments in that day, is an amazing kind of resource we just don't seem to be leveraging or catching up to. And that, to me, comes back to that point around the risk aversion piece, where it's kind of like, but the benefit so far outweighs any sort of reticence you might have, because I think, I can't even remember if it was your I think you might have had a graph on this actually at the World Congress again, where it was, you had this one line above it where it was like 4 lines, which is kind of like the average. Everyone will go to their GP like once every 2 years, and you'll have like your checkup and stuff like that. And then below the line, you've got this other one that's got basically like 700 odd lines of data in it that gets fed into a GP's record, and they can go, okay, in this 10-minute window that I have with you, I can see this and this and this and this, and here's a more effective plan. You then play that out to clinical trials as well, and someone that's looking at that and assessing efficacy. Oh my goodness. And that truncates the time horizon like you wouldn't believe, because the more data you have, the more ability to do something with it you have.
Absolutely. I mean, you've nailed it. And it really highlights, you know, the trend, right? So if you see your go to site 6 times in the year, what does that really show you on trend, right? You know, fantastic if it actually shows like a big, you know, a curve and you can see, but this is real life, you know, and so actually more data points makes it more, you're more enabled to actually recognise if there's a trend and a change, and to track that. And
the mechanisms that we have to analyse that data are so much more sophisticated now. I mean, look, COVID beautifully kind of showed us what the power of leveraging digital tech to get through all the clinical trials, like on average, like 10 years to get from a vaccine progression, truncate that down to a matter of like 6 months, a year, something insane that's never been done before. If that doesn't show you the power that we have at our disposal, I don't think anything else will. I mean, it seems like we've just got to keep banging this drum for sure.
We do. And it also has, you know, a direct increase in cost, because if you, like the big players and the big, you know, vendors out there, they know that they are one of 3, one of 2 that have been validated. Our validation process typically is 6 to 9 months, right, to even get in the door. So again, come back to that 2 years before your company fails, because you run out of funding. If you're then relying on 6 to 9 months for a validation period, that's a really long.
It's a long stretch of time.
A long stretch of time, and a big percentage of the life of your company, and that's if you get in on day one. And then you add that up with, okay, there are your typical big ones that are already in there, your 3 to 4, and the cost that they then can bid for, because they know that they're not, it's not a true competitive situation. There's 3 or 4, and they know if they're generally in a better place to win the contract, and that's when the cost of this technology really explodes. And I think there's a lot of assumption that we have, particularly with biotechs and pharma, around the fact that technology, it's very expensive. Well, yes, if you have a closed market where there are very few competitors and they're all incentivized to year on year increase their cost. Yes, the technology is incredibly expensive, but then you get your smaller innovative companies that are building their experience, that are building and have very good, robust, secure data processes, and they have very innovative pricing models to really facilitate a better connection with technology companies. So, for example, Phase 5, their pricing model is on impact. So, hey, we'll work for you for free, and if you see a benefit, then you pay for the benefit.
Yeah.
One innovative pricing model to have. It makes it a no-brainer.
100%. I think this is one of the. It also prevents the law of diffusion actually working, because you actually have, if you don't have that early adoption of these pieces up to that critical kind of mass, then you never get the rest of the crest of the wave. And so it's really frustrating when you see it from the outside perspective. We do need to shift, and I do see some green shoots of that happening. I do see, people like yourself and others in these companies advocating for it. We've just got to keep going, and I think it's hopefully going to shift with greater time, because at the end of the day, no one gets into health and all of this stuff without a want to affect some positive change for people. Yeah. And I see amazing people doing incredible work all over the place, and they want to affect that change faster and action that. And I think that's really vital, that we need to just keep pushing, and it will eventually happen.
Very good.
I've got a question around kind of education as to data security, because you've touched on that, and I think it's one of these. It seems to be like the biggest fear for people seems to be about security, data, and all that sort of stuff. How do we tackle some of those hurdles to make sure that people see the benefit more than the fear-mongering, scaremongering, and the risk that they perceive at the moment?
So data security is absolutely critical. We have to ensure data security for our patients, because the minute that a patient's data is compromised, it doesn't just impact that one pharma company, that one biotech, that one vendor. It impacts our whole industry, because patients are already quite nervous to give their data to research. They want to help with research because they see and understand the purpose of what we want to achieve, which is a better quality of life. But they also are nervous about the big headlines that are constantly coming in around data security, and worrying about how their information might be hacked. So it is absolutely critical that we ensure that our validation of vendors is good, and that ensures that we can put and build trust with our patients. But we are also a very risk-averse industry, as I mentioned earlier, and we sometimes prioritize the risk of doing something inappropriately to the risk of not doing something. Yeah. So what is the risk of not adopting this technology? Well, I think if we really map out the risk of not doing something and inaction, it's much greater than the risk of change. So by adopting new innovative technology that comes from a robust process of data security, then actually the likelihood of protecting that patient data is higher.
Yeah.
Right? If we're then looking at older technology, even paper, right? How secure is paper when it's left on a desk, when it's filed away in a filing cabinet? It's not that as secure as some of the more modern practices faced by technology. So I think we have to consider that as well.
Yeah, I think it's massive, and it's basically summarizing that is the benefit far outweighs the potential risks, and I think sometimes as an industry there is a tendency to be too risk adverse or perceive a risk to be higher than it maybe is. Mm-hmm. And that shift is really important because, as you say, ultimately it benefits more people if we do it.
Yeah.
So that's the really important part. Are there any other bits and pieces that you wanted to cover off that we haven't chatted through today, like areas that you wanted to kind of like talk about that you thought this is really exciting, things that you're kind of really jazzed about at the moment that you'd like to share with everyone?
Yeah, so I think that if I was to leave with 4 key takeaways of what I would recommend that people do, it's to one, be inspired by the opportunity of the digital innovation presents, or an ability to resolve a challenge that you have. At that point, then look at the value that potential solution has for your organisation, your clinical trial, your patient population, and then look at, okay, now we can consider which vendors and go through a robust vendor selection process. And finally, to reach out if they need any help, because there are so many health technology companies out there. There's a lot of noise, and it's very difficult to actually understand the true opportunities. To definitely reach out if anyone needs help.
Well, this has been absolutely incredible. Lauren, thank you so much. If people want to engage with you, find you, where can they go for that?
So I'd be delighted if they reach out on LinkedIn. We also have a company webpage at Zeus Plus, where we have a contact us page. So please feel free to drop us a message.
Amazing. Well, this has been an incredible discussion, and I'm looking forward to many more.
Thank you.